10,000 men, 3 meals a day, in the middle of the Wyoming desert, 200 miles from the nearest town. Every morning before dawn, railroad cooks fired up cast iron stoves mounted on rail cars and started a stew that would feed an army. Beef, usually. Beans, always. Coffee so strong it could dissolve a spoon. The stew cost the railroad about 3 cents a serving, and it was the only thing standing between 10,000 workers and starvation. This is the story of how America fed the men who built the Transcontinental Railroad. To understand what feeding this workforce actually meant, you have to picture where they were. Not where you think they were, where they actually were. By 1866, the Union Pacific Railroad was pushing west across Nebraska and into Wyoming territory. The Central Pacific was clawing east through the granite spine of the Sierra Nevada and into the Nevada desert. Between them lay more than 1,000 miles of some of the most desolate, waterless, uninhabitable land on the North American continent. There were no farms out there, no ranches, no general stores, no towns at all in most places, just sagebrush and alkali dust stretching to every horizon. The nearest supply depot for the Union Pacific was Omaha, Nebraska, and as the railroad pushed further west, that distance grew to 200 miles, then 300, then 500. For the Central Pacific, supplies came from Sacramento, hauled over the Sierra Nevada before the tunnels were even complete, dragged by ox teams and mule trains up grades so steep that wagons sometimes slid backward and killed the animals pulling them. And every single day, every one of those workers needed to eat. Think about that number for a moment. The Union Pacific employed between 8,000 and 10,000 men at its peak construction periods. The Central Pacific had 12,000 to 15,000. The vast majority of them Chinese immigrants recruited from the Pearl River Delta region of Guangdong Province. Combined, you are looking at roughly 20,000 human beings scattered across hundreds of miles of active construction, and every one of them needed roughly 3,000 calories a day just to survive the work. Because this was not office work. This was not even ordinary manual labor. These men were swinging 12-pound sledgehammers for 10 hours straight. They were drilling blast holes into solid granite by hand, one man holding the steel drill bit, while another swung an 8-pound hammer inches from his partner's fingers. They were grading roadbed in 100-degree desert heat and laying track in snowstorms that dropped 40 feet of snow on the Sierra passes. A man doing this kind of work burns through calories the way a locomotive burns through coal. Without enough food, he collapses. And a collapsed worker is a worker who is not laying track. The railroad companies understood this with perfect clarity, not because they cared about their workers as human beings, though some foremen genuinely did. They understood it because every day of delay cost them money. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 paid the railroads per mile of track completed, between $16,000 and $48,000 per mile, depending on the terrain. Time was money in the most literal sense imaginable. A workforce that could not work because it could not eat was a workforce hemorrhaging cash. So feeding these men was not charity. It was engineering. It was as much a part of building the railroad as grading the roadbed or driving the spikes. And the engineering problem was staggering. You needed roughly 40,000 pounds of food per day for the combined workforce. That is 20 tons of provisions every single day, delivered to locations that did not have roads, did not have warehouses, and did not stay in the same place for more than a week because the end of track was always moving forward. Nothing like this had been attempted in American civilian life. The only comparison was the Union Army during the Civil War, which had struggled mightily to feed its own soldiers just a few years earlier, and the Army had the advantage of established supply lines, river transport, and coastal shipping. The railroad builders had none of that. They had the railroad itself, which was, of course, the thing they were still building. This created a beautiful and maddening paradox. The railroad was the supply line for building the railroad. As each new mile of track was laid, supplies could be hauled 1 mile further, but the supplies had to arrive before the track was laid, because the men laying the track needed to eat before they could lay it. The whole operation was a snake eating its own tail, and the only way it worked was through relentless, obsessive logistical planning. The Union Pacific established supply depots along the route, massive warehouses at places like North Platte, Nebraska, and later at Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, where bulk provisions were stockpiled and then distributed forward by supply trains. These trains ran on schedules as rigid as any passenger service, because if a supply train was late by even a single day, 10,000 men went hungry, and construction stopped. There are records of supply train delays that idled hundreds of workers for 48 hours or more, costing the railroad tens of thousands of dollars while men sat beside empty pots and cursed the name of whoever was responsible. For the Central Pacific, the challenge was even more extreme. Before the summit tunnels through the Sierra Nevada were completed, supplies from Sacramento had to be hauled over the mountains by wagon. In winter, so this meant teams of men on snowshoes dragging sleds loaded with flour and salt pork through drifts taller than a two-story building. Provisions were cached in snow tunnels and mountain sheds. Entire warehouses were buried under avalanches and had to be dug out by hand. Men died moving food to the men who were dying to build the road. And all of this, every pound of flour, every barrel of salt pork, every sack of coffee beans and dried apples, had to be purchased, inventoried, shipped, stored, and distributed without refrigeration. In an era before ice-cooled rail cars became common, meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried. Vegetables, when they were available at all, were limited to root crops that could survive weeks of transport in unventilated boxcars, bouncing over rough track. Fresh fruit was a fantasy for workers at the end of track, where scurvy was a genuine concern, and dried fruit, particularly dried apples, was shipped in enormous quantities specifically to prevent it. If you're finding this story of the forgotten logistics behind the Transcontinental Railroad as fascinating as we do, take a second to subscribe. We dig into the details that the history books skip over every single week. Now, the food had to be prepared somewhere, and that brings us to one of the more ingenious inventions of the railroad construction era, the kitchen car. Picture a standard railroad boxcar, roughly 40 feet long and about 8.5 feet wide inside. Now imagine that car gutted and rebuilt as a mobile kitchen. Cast iron cook stoves, the big ones, the kind you would find in a hotel kitchen in Omaha or Chicago. Chuck were bolted directly to the floor of the car with heavy iron brackets to keep them from shifting when the car moved. Sheet metal chimneys punched through the roof to vent smoke and heat. Work tables were built along the walls, their surfaces scarred with knife marks and grease stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Storage bins held flour, sugar, salt, coffee, and dried goods in quantities measured not in pounds, but in hundredweights. Water barrels were strapped to the exterior of the car, refilled at every river crossing and water stop along the route. These kitchen cars were not stationary. They moved with the construction crews, pulled forward as each new section of track was completed. When the end of track advanced, the kitchen car advanced with it. The cooks literally rode the railroad they were helping to build, preparing meals on a recently moved platform that might have been set in place only hours before. The Union Pacific, under the direction of the Casement brothers, Jack and Dan, ran their construction operation with military precision. Jack Casement stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed about 130 pounds, and had served as a brigadier general in the Union Army. He was, by all accounts, one of the toughest men on the railroad, and he organized his workforce the way he had organized his troops. The mess operation was no exception. Dining cars were set up alongside the kitchen cars, long, narrow rail cars fitted with rough plank tables and benches where hundreds of men could eat in shifts. A worker's meal break was typically 30 minutes, and during that half hour, the dining car operated like a factory. Men filing in one end, eating, and filing out the other to make room for the next group. The cooks themselves were a specialized workforce within the workforce. The Union Pacific employed dedicated cooks and their assistants, men who did nothing but prepare food, day after day, for months or years on end. These were not chefs. They were not trained in any culinary tradition. They were men who could keep a fire going, boil a stew, bake bread in a cast-iron Dutch oven, and brew coffee in quantities measured in gallons, not cups. Their skill was endurance and consistency, not creativity, and their working conditions were miserable in their own particular way. While the track layers froze in Wyoming blizzards, the cooks sweated over cast iron stoves and enclosed rail cars where the temperature could reach 120 degrees in summer. A typical day for a railroad cook started around 3 in the morning. The fires had to be built up in the cook stoves, which took time because you were coaxing heat from cast iron, not flipping a switch on a modern gas burner. Water had to be hauled from whatever source was available, often a creek or river a quarter-mile from camp, sometimes a tank car filled at a previous water stop. By 4:30, the coffee had to be boiling and the morning meal underway. Breakfast was usually the simplest meal of the day. Salt pork or bacon fried in its own grease until the edges curled and blackened. Beans, often left over from the previous night, reheated until they were hot enough to eat, but not so hot they burned the tin plates. And hardtack, those dense squares of unleavened flour and water baked until they were nearly indestructible. The workers called them by various names, most of them unprintable, but sheet iron and tooth dullers were among the kinder ones. A man could soak hardtack in coffee to soften it, or fry it in pork grease to make it palatable. It was not good food by any standard, but it was food, and it was calories, and it would keep a man on his feet swinging a hammer for a few hours. The midday meal was sometimes brought forward to the worksite in buckets and pails, especially when the end of track was miles from the kitchen car. Cold beans, hardtack, and cold coffee were the standard fare. Workers ate where they stood or sat on the ground beside the grade, shoveling food with tin spoons or their fingers, swatting at flies that had followed the food from the kitchen car, and then went immediately back to work. There was no ceremony to it. There was no pleasure in it. It was fuel, consumed the way a man throws wood on a fire, quickly and without thought. Dinner was the main meal, and this is where the 3-cent stew enters the story. The evening stew was the anchor of the railroad diet. It was made from whatever beef was available, usually fresh killed when cattle could be driven to the construction camps, or salted beef when fresh meat was not an option, which was often. Bones were boiled for broth. Beans went in, because beans always went in. Potatoes when available. Onions occasionally. Whatever root vegetables could survive the punishing supply chain without rotting. The whole thing simmered in massive cast iron pots on the kitchen car stoves, sometimes for hours when the schedule allowed. Sometimes thrown together in 45 minutes when crews came in late and the cooks had to scramble. The cost of 3 cents per serving is an estimate drawn from railroad supply records of the era. The Union Pacific's financial documents show bulk purchases of beef at roughly 4 to 6 cents per pound, flour at 2 to 3 cents per pound, beans at about 4 cents per pound, and coffee at 15 to 20 cents per pound. When you are cooking in bulk for thousands of men, using the cheapest possible ingredients, and stretching every pound of beef with water and bones and beans until it feeds as many mouths as physically possible, 3 cents per serving of stew is not just plausible. It is probably generous. Some meals almost certainly cost less. Dried fruit was distributed separately, often as a ration rather than as part of a prepared meal. Each man might receive a small handful of dried apples or dried peaches per day, intended primarily to prevent scurvy rather than to provide any kind of eating pleasure. Sugar was rationed as well, and coffee, despite its relative expense, was considered absolutely essential. Foremen and construction bosses understood something fundamental about managing men in miserable conditions. Workers would tolerate bad food, dangerous work, and brutal hours, but take away their coffee and you would have a mutiny on your hands. The total cost of feeding the Union Pacific workforce has been estimated at between $30,000 and $50,000 per month during peak construction periods. That is roughly $1 to $2 million in today's money, spent every month just on food. For the Central Pacific, the costs looked different because the food procurement model for Chinese workers was entirely different. If you're subscribed to this channel, you already know we cover these forgotten chapters of American history. If you're not, now would be a good time. Because this next part of the story is one of the most fascinating and least told aspects of the entire transcontinental railroad saga. The railroad was built by two companies racing toward each other. The Union Pacific built west from Omaha. The Central Pacific built east from Sacramento. And the workforces of these two companies could not have been more different. which meant the food cultures that sustained them could not have been more different either. The Union Pacific's laborers were overwhelmingly Irish immigrants, and along with Civil War veterans from both the Union and Confederate sides, freed African Americans and a scattering of other European immigrants. These men came from a broadly similar food culture. They ate meat, bread, beans, potatoes, and coffee. It was the American frontier diet, heavy on calories, low on variety, built around whatever could be salted, dried, or baked hard enough to survive weeks of transport in an unrefrigerated boxcar. The Central Pacific's laborers were predominantly Chinese. By 1866, Chinese workers made up roughly 80% of the Central Pacific's construction force, numbering between 10 and 12,000 men. And they brought their food culture with them across the Pacific Ocean, and they held onto it with a tenacity that shaped everything about how the Central Pacific operated. This is not a small detail. It is one of the defining features of daily life on the Central Pacific Railroad. The Chinese workers did not eat the same food as the white workers. They did not eat from the same kitchens. They did not even want to. And the Central Pacific's management, after initial resistance, learned to accommodate this, because the alternative was losing the best workforce they had ever employed. From the very beginning, the Chinese workers organized their own food procurement. They were divided into work gangs of 12 to 20 men, and each gang had a headman who managed the group's affairs, including food. The gangs hired their own cooks, Chinese men who specialized in preparing Cantonese-style meals under field conditions. They pooled a portion of their wages to pay for provisions, and they purchased those provisions not from the railroad's general supply chain, but from Chinese merchants in San Francisco and Sacramento who specialized in importing goods from southern China. The supply chain was remarkable in its own right. Dried fish, including cuttlefish, abalone, and various salted ocean fish, was packed into barrels and shipped by rail and wagon from San Francisco to the end of track, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles through the mountains. Dried mushrooms, dried bamboo shoots, dried seaweed, and dried bean curd traveled the same route. Rice came in 100-pound sacks, shipped in enormous quantities, because rice was the foundation of every single meal. Tea was purchased by the crate, both green tea and oolong, and it was consumed not as a luxury or an occasional indulgence, but as a daily necessity, and served at every meal and throughout the working day. Peanut oil and soy sauce were imported. Dried oysters and dried shrimp came packed in wooden crates from the fishing communities along the California coast, where Chinese fishermen had been working since the gold rush years. Chinese merchants in Sacramento maintained inventories specifically tailored to the railroad workforce, and they transported these goods forward along the completed sections of track as construction advanced. The cooking methods were different from the Union Pacific in nearly every respect. While the Union Pacific cooks relied on stewing and frying in cast iron, the Chinese cooks used woks heated over wood or charcoal fires, boiled rice in large covered pots, and prepared dishes that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with Cantonese home cooking. Stir-fried vegetables with dried shrimp, rice porridge with salted fish for breakfast, steamed rice served alongside dried mushrooms reconstituted in hot water and flavored with soy sauce. Tea, always tea, prepared carefully and served in small cups throughout the day. And here is where the story takes a turn that nobody at the time fully understood, but that had profound consequences. The Chinese workers were significantly healthier than the workers on the Union Pacific. Not by a little bit, by a lot. The dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases that plagued railroad construction camps hit the Union Pacific workers hard. These men drank water straight from rivers and streams, unboiled and untreated. They drank it cold, and they drank it constantly because the physical labor created a thirst that felt bottomless. The Chinese workers boiled their water every single time, not because they understood germ theory, which would not be widely accepted in Western medicine for another decade, but because their entire food culture required it. You cannot make tea without boiling water. You cannot cook rice without boiling water. Every meal the Chinese cooks prepared involved bringing large quantities of water to a rolling boil. and the workers drank hot tea instead of raw creek water throughout the day. The result was striking enough that it was noticed and documented by the railroad's own supervisors. James Strobridge, the Central Pacific's construction superintendent, a man who had initially opposed hiring Chinese laborers and had to be overruled by Charles Crocker, came to consider the Chinese workers the finest workforce he had ever managed. Their relative health was one of the major reasons. While Union Pacific camps were periodically devastated by outbreaks of intestinal disease that could sideline hundreds of workers for days or weeks, the Chinese work gangs kept working. Their food was literally keeping them alive in ways that went far beyond simple calorie counts. But the food also reflected something deeper than nutrition, or even health. It reflected identity. It reflected who these men were, thousands of miles from their families, in a country that regarded them with suspicion and often open hostility. Anti-Chinese sentiment was already a potent force in California and across the West. Chinese workers were paid less than white workers doing the same labor. They were given the most dangerous assignments, including the nightmarish work of being lowered in woven reed baskets over the sheer granite cliffs of Cape Horn to drill blast holes and set nitroglycerin charges. Hundreds of Chinese workers died in these operations and in the Summit Tunnel excavations. Many of their bodies were never recovered, entombed forever in the Sierra Nevada granite they had been paid to destroy. In this context, food was more than sustenance. It was a declaration. It was continuity. It was a daily act of saying, even if only to themselves and to each other, that they were still Cantonese men from the Pearl River Delta, still connected to a culture that stretched back thousands of years. A bowl of rice with dried fish and a cup of oolong tea, eaten while sitting on a granite boulder at 7,000 feet elevation in the Sierra Nevada. With snow piled 40 feet deep around the entrance to the tunnel they were carving by hand, was an act of cultural preservation as much as it was a meal. The Irish workers on the Union Pacific had their own version of this, though it looked different and tasted different. Their food was the food of the American frontier, descended from the provisioning traditions of the British Isles, filtered through generations of adaptation to North American conditions. Salted beef and pork. Potatoes when they could get them. And the absence of potatoes was felt keenly by men whose families had fled Ireland during the Great Famine less than 20 years earlier. Bread baked fresh when a good cook could manage it, hardtack when he could not. Whiskey distributed in controlled rations by some foremen and available freely, perhaps too freely, in the raucous end-of-track towns that sprang up and dissolved behind the advancing construction line. Those end-of-track towns, places with names like Hell on Wheels, Julesburg, Benton, and Bear River City, had their own food economy entirely separate from the railroad's mess operation. Saloons served meals alongside liquor. Enterprising merchants set up rough restaurants in canvas tents and knocked together shacks, selling fried steaks and boiled potatoes and actual bread at prices that would have made the 3-cent stew look like the bargain it was. These establishments catered to workers willing to spend a chunk of their monthly wages on something that actually tasted like food, rather than endure another evening of camp stew that tasted like the inside of a cast iron pot. But the camp stew was what kept them alive between paydays. And it was the only food available to men who were too far from any town, too exhausted to walk to one or too broke to buy anything else. If you've stayed with this story all the way to here, you're the kind of viewer we make these for. Hit subscribe, because we have more stories about the forgotten human details of American history, and they go deeper than you'd expect. Now, we come to the part of this story that almost no history book tells. Not the logistics, not the menus, not the supply chains, but what mealtime actually meant to the men who sat down and ate. Imagine the end of a 12-hour day on the Union Pacific grade somewhere in Wyoming Territory, summer of 1868. You have been swinging a sledgehammer since dawn. Your hands are cracked and bleeding through calluses thick enough to stop a knife. The Wyoming wind has been sandblasting your face with alkali grit all day long, and your lips are so chapped they split open when you talk. The sun is finally going down, and the temperature, which was 95 degrees at noon with not a scrap of shade anywhere on the high plains, is already dropping toward freezing because this is high desert country, and the temperature swings in summer can be 50 degrees or more between midday and midnight. And then you hear the dinner bell, that sound, a cast iron triangle beaten with a steel rod, or sometimes just a cook banging on the bottom of a pot with an iron ladle. It carried across the flat terrain for half a mile or more, and it was the most welcome sound in these men's world. It meant the day was over. It meant you had survived another 12 hours without being crushed by a dropped rail, blown to pieces by a mishandled charge of blasting powder, shot by a hostile raiding party, or bitten by a rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a railroad tie. It meant you could stop. It meant you could sit down. Sitting down, you and I take that for granted. Now try to imagine how extraordinary that simple act becomes when you have been standing and swinging and lifting and carrying for 12 consecutive hours in brutal heat or bitter cold. The act of lowering yourself onto a wooden bench in a dining car or onto the bare ground beside a campfire and being handed a tin plate of hot stew and a tin cup of strong black coffee was, for these men, the closest thing to comfort that existed anywhere in their lives. They ate together. And that mattered more than the food itself. On the Union Pacific, the dining cars seated men in long rows, elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder. You ate next to the same men you worked beside on the grade, the same men you slept near in the canvas tents or rough wooden bunkhouse cars that followed the construction line. You passed the salt. You complained about the food, and complaining about the food was itself a form of social bonding, a shared grievance that made men feel less alone. You told stories about the day's close calls, about the man in the next gang over who got his foot crushed by a dropped rail and was carried screaming to the hospital car, about the rumor that the supply train was bringing fresh beef tomorrow instead of the salted stuff that tasted like shoe leather soaked in brine. In a mealtime was the only social hour these men had. There were no parlors, no reading rooms, no gathering places that did not charge money. The dining car was it. And despite the monotony of beans and stew and hardtack, despite the weevils in the flour and the grit in the coffee and the fact that the salt pork had been salt pork yesterday and would be salt pork again tomorrow, those 30 minutes of sitting and eating and talking were the thread that held the social fabric of these camps together. The Chinese workers had their own version of this communal experience, but structured differently. They ate in their work gangs. Small groups of 12 to 20 men gathered around shared dishes of rice, vegetables, and dried fish. The atmosphere was, by most accounts, calmer and more orderly than the Union Pacific dining cars, which could be boisterous, loud, and occasionally violent when men had been drinking. The Chinese workers ate with chopsticks from shared bowls, poured tea for each other, and maintained a mealtime routine that observers from outside the Chinese community consistently described as dignified. A journalist visiting a Central Pacific construction camp in the Sierra Nevada in 1867 described watching Chinese cooks prepare a meal of steamed rice, dried fish, reconstituted with vegetables in a wok, and tea served in small ceramic cups that the workers carried in their personal kits. He noted the contrast with the Union Pacific camps he had visited, where meals were consumed quickly and without ceremony. Among the Chinese workers, he wrote, eating appeared to be the one activity during the day that was not rushed. The cooks knew what their role really was. The best cooks, the ones who lasted through the full years of construction, understood that their job was not just to prevent starvation, their job was to maintain morale. And the difference between a cook who understood this and a cook who did not could be measured directly in how hard the men worked the next day. Railroad records from the era document complaints about food quality with surprising frequency. Workers petitioned foremen. Foremen complained to superintendents. When the food was particularly bad, when spoiled beef was served because someone had failed to check the barrels, or when the bread was so full of weevils that it visibly moved on the plate, workers slowed down, not always as a formal strike, though food-related work stoppages did occur among both the Chinese and Irish workforces. More often, it was organic and collective, a shared sullenness, a slight but measurable drop in the pace of work that cost the railroad money just as surely as a full stoppage would have. On the other hand, men who felt their cook was trying, even when the results were mediocre, even when the stew was thin and the coffee was weak, worked with more energy. It was not about the quality of the food in any absolute sense. It was about the quality of the effort. A cook who clearly did not care produced workers who clearly did not care. A cook who did his best with terrible ingredients and impossible conditions produced something that went beyond calories. He produced the feeling that someone in this vast, brutal, indifferent enterprise actually gave a damn whether you lived or died. That feeling was worth more than the 3 cents per serving. And when the work was done, when the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869, and the 2 locomotives touched cowcatchers, while the dignitaries shook hands for the photographers, there was, among other things, a celebration meal. The executives ate well that day, champagne and fine food served on white tablecloths in Leland Stanford's private railcar. The workers ate what they always ate, stew and beans and hardtack and coffee on the Union Pacific side, rice and dried fish and tea on the Central Pacific side. The Chinese workers, who had built some of the most dangerous and technically demanding sections of the entire railroad, on including every foot of the Summit Tunnel and the treacherous Cape Horn Passage, were not even included in the official ceremony photographs. They are absent from the famous image of the 2 locomotives meeting, pushed to the margins of the event their labor had made possible. 3 cents a serving, 3 meals a day, 10,000 men on the Union Pacific, 12,000 on the Central Pacific. For 6 years, from 1863 to 1869, an army of cooks and provisioners and supply train operators and Chinese merchants and cattle drovers and flour millers performed a daily miracle of logistics that rivaled the construction of the railroad itself. They moved 20 tons of food per day across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, and they converted that food into meals that kept the largest construction workforce in American history alive and working. And the food they prepared is as forgotten as the names of the men who ate it. We remember the Golden Spike. We remember Leland Stanford and Thomas Durant and the famous photographs at Promontory. We remember the gleaming locomotives Jupiter and 119 facing each other on the completed track. But we do not remember the stew. We do not remember the dried cuttlefish shipped from San Francisco to the Sierra summit in wooden barrels. We do not remember the oolong tea poured from blackened pots into ceramic cups at 7,000 feet. We do not remember the cook who woke at 3 in the morning in a boxcar kitchen in the middle of the Wyoming desert and built up the fire in his cast iron stove so that 10,000 exhausted, broken, half-starved men could have something hot in their bellies before they went out to change the shape of a continent. Those cooks fed the workers who connected America from coast to coast, and almost nobody recorded their names. The supply train operators, the Chinese merchants, the cattle drovers who walked herds of beef to the end of track across 200 miles of open desert, the bakers who mixed flour and water in wooden troughs in the back of jolting rail cars. All of them forgotten. The least we can do, more than a century and a half later, is remember what they made, and who they made it for, and what it cost. 3 cents a serving. And the labor of men who built a nation and received almost nothing in return.